Thanks, Harley. Can you hear me all right, Harley, as a test case?
Yes, I can.
Right. And thank you, Susan, for giving me an opportunity to talk to everybody here. And everybody, thank you for blowing through your Friday lunch to listen to this. So as Harley has explained, what I want to talk through today is a little bit different to the story you normally hear about climate change, which is the risk of inaction on climate change. It's usually associated with rising sea levels, and there's usually a picture of a polar bear somewhere. And I want to talk about the risks of action on climate change. What might actually happen if we start to get organised and aligned with the science? I guess as an introduction to approach, I'm more than welcome to take questions as we go through this.
Okay.
And mechanism-wise, I understand if you send through a chat, then Harley will pick that up and rudely interrupt me. Is that correct, Harley?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah.
Right. And I'll try and pause at the end of each of the slides, of which there are maybe not quite a dozen. So I'm hoping the talk proper will be about half an hour, 35 minutes, and then we'll allow for, let's get my timer on so I don't blow through that. And then we'll move into questions. So the way I'm going to approach that today is, if you think about the domain of climate change, you can break that down into three broad buckets. The first on the left-hand side is the science. And the science is very clear that we should do everything we can to ensure that the planet not warm beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. Driving from the science, we move to the words, and the words take two forms: the legislation, the law, and also the investment community, the capital markets. And they're evolving to 1.5 degrees Celsius with wiggle room, particularly for politicians. But then if you flow through to the consequent words, the consequent action from that, the policies most notably, we're really in New Zealand at central and local government level doing, I won't say nothing, but almost nothing meaningful on climate change. So what I want to talk about today is I want to step through the science and the words, where we're actually at, and then I want to explore a scenario which poses the question, what might actually happen if the government, central and local, starts to impose policies that actually align more with the science and the words? So I'll jump straight into that, talk about the science. This is a very big topic, and I'm not going to go into this in mega detail. I can point to a couple of sources. But there's a character called Associate Professor John Cook from George Mason University who managed to boil down the entire world of climate change to 10 words. And they are, it's real, climate change is happening. It's measured by, typically represented by the average surface temperature of the planet versus pre-industrial level. And we have very clear and independent evidence from multiple sources which tell us the planet is warming and is now roughly 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels and marching up. It is caused by us, it's us. The science behind climate change, and specifically anthropogenic people-caused climate change, has been worked up for a long time. The models that have been developed, of which there are many and have been for several decades, align almost perfectly with the measurements, the thermometers. So we know that the planet's heating is being caused by greenhouse gases that we are emitting and have been emitting and are emitting, most notably carbon dioxide and methane. Experts agree. There is no debate at all within the climate science community about whether or not those two things I have just told you are true. Unfortunately, the oil and gas industry has led a very well-funded obfuscation campaign, very similar to a campaign that was run by the tobacco industry in the 50s and 60s to cloud the link between smoking and lung cancer, and in doing so, delay action. So what that boils down to is, in practice, because of that misinformation campaign, upwards of a third of New Zealanders are not sure that climate change is caused by humans, unfortunately, and that does make action a little bit harder. But in summary, experts agree. Thousands and thousands of papers, experts agree. It's bad. I'm going to talk more about it's bad in a moment. But fortunately, and this is the bring you down then bring you up, there is hope. But there is only hope if we take action. And in fact, specifically, there is only hope really if we start to move the action of central and local governments, most notably, towards the science. So I'll jump into the it's bad bit, and I'll quote the words of David Wallace Wells. It is worse, much worse than you think. But David Wallace Wells is the editor of the New Yorker magazine. In 2017, he observed there were a lot of climate stories passing across his desk that sounded bad but had not really been boiled down to a coherent story. So he did so in 2017 with an article called The Uninhabitable Earth, and it connected the research, the science, with storytelling in a way similar to Malcolm Gladwell. And it overnight became the biggest, the most read article. I think they had 6 million reads within a very short period of time on that website. It was so popular that they decided that they wanted to write a book. So David was sent away to a lake somewhere where he collected the latest and greatest science and boiled it down to a book of the same name, The Uninhabitable Earth. It immediately became a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. And I'd strongly suggest you read that. It's quite a readable story. It has been challenged in some cases as being overly alarmist, or definitely the early one, the article. But what it does do is it provides a direct link through to the science. So if you want to read the raw journal article, you can do so and form your own view. And the reason I think this statement now holds water is because we, the 1.5 project, a not-for-profit I set up a year ago, undertook a survey bringing research from George Mason and Yale universities down to New Zealand. And what we asked a bunch of questions, but one of them was, when do you think climate change will start to harm people in New Zealand? And the average response to that in New Zealand is about 30 years. In Australia, it's the same question was slightly better. They thought that harm would happen in about 26 years. That survey was run about 2 years ago in Australia. And if you believe that the harm caused by the fires in Australia over summer, fires that were bookended by extreme storm and flooding weather events, represent harm to human beings, then there's clearly a fundamental disconnect between the belief of the average Australian and New Zealander and what the science is what's actually playing out in the science. So the question then becomes, what is the right temperature for us to get to? Like 3 is better than 4, 2 is better than 3. What's the right temperature? Some work was published in Nature magazine in November of last year, and it boiled down what is still an evolving science of tipping points, or tipping elements is another term used. These tipping elements represent, in some cases, sudden, but often irreversible in human timescales. Like you can turn them around in 100,000 years, but not in 10 or 100. And there are a number of them that are observed most closely, but I'm going to highlight a couple of them. On the right-hand side, we have the coral reefs, large-scale die-offs. That's happening now. There is a 99% chance that those reefs will die at 2 degrees, and I think it's a 67% chance that they will all be gone at 1.5 degrees. There's 2 others of note that are connected to what are effectively think of as dominoes of tipping events. If one goes, the other is more likely to go. The first is the West Antarctic ice shelf down the bottom. That represents 3 meters of sea level rise, with a very high chance that that will melt if we allow the planet to go beyond 1.5 degrees. It won't melt instantaneously. We're talking centuries of melting, but it will be unstoppable once it goes. Similarly, the Greenland ice shelf, same story, but it represents 7 meters of sea level rise. So collectively, those 2 blocks of ice, north and south, represent 10 meters of global sea level rise. That will most likely be tipped beyond 1.5. The other one of note is the Amazon rainforest. A body of work that was published earlier this year represented or shared the work of 200 scientists that had physically tape measured 135,000 trees across the Amazon in Africa And what they found is the Amazon rainforest, areas that have not been deforested, so just structurally intact as they describe them, areas are absorbing less and less carbon per hectare. And their midpoint estimate is that the Amazon rainforest will shift from being a sink of carbon to a source of carbon. It will release carbon around 2034, so a bit more than a decade from now. There's big variability around that, but that's an incredibly important regulator of temperatures. And when that does tip, that will rapidly, within decades, tip from being a rainforest that creates rain to a savanna. Moving on. So the punchline of all of that is that we really want to work hard to make sure that the planet doesn't go above 1.5. And the health community is screaming the same thing. So on the left-hand side, we have a whole bunch of logos, which is basically everybody who's in any way associated with health in New Zealand. And they recognise that human-caused climate change is a serious and urgent threat to health and health equity. And they are advocating a reduction to net zero greenhouse by 2040, which is 1.5 or even slightly better, if you believe such a thing were possible. So in summary, all of the scientific experts, health and cardigan-wearing climate scientists, are recommending don't go beyond 1.5. But the words are a little bit fuzzier, and I'll talk to a few different layers of words. The first is at the top of Bank of England and Financial Stability Board are the voices of the investment community, most notably out of Europe. And I'll quote the words of Mark Carney, who was the chair of Bank of England and the Financial Stability Board. He says, carbon emissions have to decline by 45% from 2010 levels over the next decade in order to reach net zero by 2050. This requires a massive reallocation of capital. If some companies and industries fail to adjust to this new world, they will fail to exist. So that statement from Mark Carney is code for 1.5. Below that, we have the governments of the day. So most notably here, we have the New Zealand government, and we have Auckland, who is leading the charge on this. So the New Zealand government has introduced at the end of last year, under almost unanimous agreement, the Zero Carbon Act. The purpose of that act is to establish a framework that New Zealand can use to develop clear and stable policies which contribute to the effort to limit the global average temperature increase to 1.5 above pre-industrial levels. And Auckland Council has agreed that they will reduce the emissions of Auckland region, not just the council, not just the rubbish trucks and their cars, but the whole region by 50% by 2030. So that is a 1.5 compliant plan. MFE, who's the other actor in this space, in the government space, is much fuzzier and more ambiguous. Whilst they say 1.5, the targets they are sharing, most notably in the recent ETS, bear no resemblance to the science of 1.5, and that's being challenged behind closed doors at the moment. Lastly, the people, so the youth on that front, we have seen them in the marches. We will see more of that as our country opens up. And what we're also seeing is the rise of civil disobedience. And that's not just coming from the tie-dyed hippies. One person of note who has taken and is taking a more active stance on this is Sir Jonathan Porritt, a leading voice in this space, co-founder of the Green Party, advisor to Air New Zealand. And he has come to the conclusion that the path that we're taking just doesn't work. And that we actually need to move at scale to civil disobedience, akin to what we saw out of Extinction Rebellion, Greenpeace, Sea Shepherd. And he cited a occupation of Nancy Pelosi's office last year, where a whole bunch of youth took that over, as being the sort of thing that we need to see more of. So we will see more of those sorts of words from a broader audience. In many cases, it will make industry's continued inaction increasingly hard. So the words are tipping to 1.5, but the action is nowhere near that. So globally, we're a long way from Paris. There is a group of universities called Climate Action Tracker, who synthesize the current policies of the most important countries around the world. Their midpoint estimate is that current policies will deliver us around 3 degrees, maybe as bad as 4 degrees. The global insurance industry estimates that we are heading for more like closer to 4 degrees of global warming on current policies. We are currently 1 degree above pre-industrial levels, and we need to get to no more than 1.5. In New Zealand, our actions are, whilst our policy, whilst the Zero Carbon Act is great, it's a little bit like saying that you're going to climb Mount Everest, but all you've done is book a ticket to Nepal. You haven't started training, you haven't got a plan, you don't even really know where the mountain is. So the intent is good, but the policies are a long way away. And in fact, the policies of New Zealand, as ranked by Climate Action Tracker, lead us to a roughly 3 degrees world, which puts us in the same camp as the Australians, which for many of us is embarrassing. So the action's a long way away from 3 degrees, but what might happen if that changed? What might happen if central and local governments get their act together and start bringing in policies that actually align with the science and the Zero Carbon Act words that they have promised? So now I want to jump into that and talk about what that future might look like. Before I do so, I'm going to explain where emissions come from. What that reduction is at scale and where, roughly speaking, they come from. In short, we need a reduction of about, call it 60% by 2030 to pull our weight. On the left-hand side, we have a copy-paste from the IPCC, the Global Bible 2018 report, and it says, in model pathways where no or limited overshoot of 1.5C, so we don't blow through that, we sort of gracefully level off at 1.5, global anthropogenic CO2 emissions decline by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030. They have done lots of modeling. They've done, it's about 92 different scenarios that get to 1.5, and in all of the scenarios where we don't blow through it, we reduce by that amount. For New Zealand, that means a 54% from 2017 levels. For it to be only 54%, that's getting off lightly. You have to believe two things. You have to believe, firstly, that carbon capture and storage, and think really massive air conditioning units that suck carbon out of the world at scale, exist, and they exist at scale and are economically viable. That is not the case at the moment. And in many cases, people are not willing to put that in part of their equations, but let's just assume they do exist around 2035. The second thing you need to believe for it to be only 54% is that New Zealand will only pull its weight globally. It won't do better than developing nations. It won't accept the fact that it is well-heeled economically and that it has benefited from a century of emissions, that it will just do the average. We have not said that. Under the Paris Accord, we've actually said we'll do more than the average because we are developed and we have benefit. But let's just assume we do the average. If you don't assume those two things, then that 54% is more like 70+%. So as a guide, recognizing that emissions have continued to rise over the last few years, we need to reduce our emissions around 50 to 60. I typically say 60%. If you then ask what that means, on the right-hand side of the page, we have the emissions in CO2 equivalent for New Zealand in 2017. So gross emissions, the stuff that was released into the atmosphere from burning in animals, was 81 million tonnes. 24 million tonnes were soaked up by the trees, in summary, to give us net emissions that went on to heat the planet of 57 million tonnes. To reduce our emissions by 54%, that would mean pulling 31 million tonnes of emissions out by 2030 in order to get back to 26 million tonnes of emissions in 2030. By the way, on a path to sort of closer to zero. So that's the challenge. So the challenge, if we're to deliver on a 1.5 compliant future, is New Zealand needs to find call it 30 to 35 million tonnes of reductions behind the couch over the next decade to pull our weight. So I'll just pause there and see, Harley, are there any questions or is there anything that you would like me to expand on before I jump into how we might find 30 to 35? You're on mute.
Apologies. No, there's no questions at the moment, so feel free to proceed.
Okay, so what we hear a lot about is net zero 2050. That is complete nonsense. It is a lie of emissions. So 1.5 has all but nothing to do with 2050 and everything to do with the next 5 to 10 years. So this chart shows two things. On the colourful lines are these scenarios that were run by the New Zealand Productivity Commission, who published an excellent body of work in August 2018 that considered different decline paths to net zero or to 26 million tonnes by 2050. They included one, the dotted blue line, that they called disruptive decarbonisation. It was an outlier in there for a giggle that you would never really use. Unfortunately, what happened a month later, the IPCC published their work, which said, well, even, if you assume that you only do the average, and if you assume that carbon capture exists, storage exists, at a bare minimum, you've got to follow the dark black dotted line. So whilst it is true that we get to 2050 to zero by 2050, it is the pathway that matters. And we need to call it 60% out by 2030. So please ignore the lie of emission that has been run by governments and focus on the 2030 target. That will decide what our climate future looks like. And I'd also like to say that our risk builds over time. This is a chart pulled together by a Norwegian academic, and it considers what reductions we might go through had we started, or were we to start, reducing emissions globally at different levels. We can see the darkest of the blue lines, which starts to drop away around 2000, and it shows a really gentle decline down to 2100. That's what we would have done had in 2000 we decided to drop our emissions globally. But globally, what has happened is we've pursued the dark black line, and we're now at a point where our emissions need to fall globally, and in New Zealand, if not more, by the dark black line. So from 45 gigatons a year down 60%, the 60% I talked about, down to net zero by 2050, and staying at net zero for there on forever. If we don't do so, if we carry on burning coal and releasing emissions as we are doing today for the next decade, we blow through our budget. Each chunk of emissions just builds in the atmosphere. In American terms, it just puts another blanket on the climate, and we get to a point where we can no longer stay below 1.5. So at that point in 2030, we would need to turn everything off almost instantaneously in order to have a 66% chance of staying below 1.5. So it doesn't get easier. And in fact, what is most likely going to happen is as the effects of climate change become more and more evident, governments will become more and more heavy-handed in their interventions, and they will start to make various actions illegal. For example, the purchase of internal combustion engines, which is proposed to be illegal in the United Kingdom after 2032, and in some other countries after 25. So we're better off making a decision now rather than letting the government of the day make that decision. So it's then useful and in some ways entertaining to find out where these emissions come from. And this is a breakdown of what that looks like. The bottom of this chart is where emissions come from, is a chart I showed you previously, sorry. 81 million tonnes less 24 million tonnes of trees, 57, we might need to find 31 to get back to 26. So 39 of the 81 comes mainly from Fonterra and some meat companies. The companies I'm going to show you on the right hand side typically represent 50 to 70% of the category. across either scope 1, 2 or 3 for the pointy headed. Road transportation is 14 million of 81. That's the companies that sell the petrol and the companies that sell the machines that use the petrol and diesel. One might also include the companies that use those machines to do stuff like main freight. 7 million tonnes comes from process heat to make products. The biggest players there are Fonterra, 2.5 million tonnes of gas and coal to dry milk, and Methanex about 1.7 million tonnes to make methanol, which is exported. Both of those things are mainly exported. Industrial process and product use is a terrible term that describes making stuff where the chemistry creates the carbon. So this is Rio Tinto aluminium, BlueScope, and Golden Bay cement. The difference with these guys is you really can't fix them in a decade. You can close them, and Rio Tinto announced yesterday that they would do so. But all that really does is move those emissions somewhere else on the planet. You can't really fix them in a decade because the processes are at their emergent stage in terms of technologies that don't emit carbon. Conversely, you can fix very easily, technically, drying milk with baby milk, drying coal, baby milk with coal. It's just really expensive. So moving on, energy industries, this is mainly electricity. 4 of 5 is making electricity, Genesis and Contact Coal and Gas, and roughly 1 making petrol and diesel in Whangarei. 4 is waste, landfill, methane, and 7 is other. So 2 of 7 is fugitives, which is literally leaky or flaring gas pipes. Less than 1 of 7 is domestic aviation, so 1 of 81. So domestically, aviation accounts for about 1% of total emissions. International aviation is not included in these numbers for boring reasons. It's about 3-ish as comparison. And then you end up with miscellaneous, so trains, offshore fishing fleet, the forestry fleet, offshore farm, off-road farm vehicles. So that's where they come from. So the question then becomes, I've got to find 30 to 35 million tonnes. Where am I going to find that? Any further questions before I move on? Any questions, Harley?
Sorry, we've got 2 good questions. You may come to them later, but first question was around the lessons that we can learn from COVID in terms of reducing emissions.
Yes.
And the second one was around the science and the fact that the science has told us for some time about climate change, but given an impression that we had a lot more time to act, and that the impact would be some way off in the future. So the question was around, are we confident that this more concerning time frame is accurate? Are the scientists right this time?
Yep. So I'll get to the COVID question towards the end because it does teach us a lot. It's a really important question. To the question around whether the science is now right, the science has been very clear on the scale and rate of the consequences of ongoing release of greenhouse gas for, call it 3 decades now. The models have predicted what has happened incredibly well, and the models continue to predict what is happening incredibly well. So what we are now seeing in what some people are calling is a sudden acceleration is not a sudden understanding of the science. It's a sudden awakening of elements of mainstream society on the consequences of what will happen as our climate changes. So we can say with very, very high confidence that what we have been predicting, the science community have been predicting for several decades, will happen as a best case. The emergent models, and we're going to get the next version of the IPCC report next year, the emergent models, of which there are about 50, are identifying, however, some further risks that were not well understood, notably feedback loops and the use of clouds, and they're addressing a thing which is called climate sensitivity. And some of those models suggest the outcome could be further and faster than we had expected. So our risks are all really on the downside. That uncertainty does not help us in any way, and it absolutely does not need the change. Does not change the view of the scientific community that we all need to very, very rapidly reduce our emissions. Okay. So I'll jump on now to where we might get these from. So thus far, I've really just acted as a curator of science and legislation, and so much so that in many cases I have literally quoted or copy-pasted elements that have come from respected sources, like the government, like the IPCC. Here I will share with you an analysis that has spanned 18 months, stood the test of about 2,500 presentations to 2,500 people. It is an area where reasonable people might disagree, but after lots of disagreement across tables, these numbers kind of seem to stand the test of time. And at the end of this, I'll tell you why they might be wrong as well, areas where I might have got the wrong. So firstly, I'd argue of the 30 to 35, we'll probably get 9 to 12 out of stuff that's kind of underway or where the market will get us there. So starting from the top, we will have a cost of carbon soon. The ETS is coming in. And for both that and also for social license to operate reasons, the gas industry will plug leaky gas pipes. So I've assumed that we'll get 1 to 2 out of that. You can't fix planes in a decade. You can use them less, and we may do that, but it's such a small number that it's hard to move the dial meaningfully. Waste will be better managed. Councils are moving to do that now. Anaerobic composting or use of waste as a biogas source. So I pulled 3 out of 4 for that by 2030. Energy industries, so coal and gas and that construct will be increasingly challenged by renewables whose costs keep dropping, and batteries for intra and intraday peaking. We will still end up with some seasonal level gaps needing to be filled. So I pulled 3 out of 5 for that. Industrial processes and product use is really hard. I've snuck sort of 0 to 1 out from efficiencies. Now that it looks like aluminium is going to close, maybe that becomes 1 to 1.5, but it's not a big number. Manufacturing industries and construction, there is no sign yet that the ETS is going to move to meaningful cost levels. At least that's not indicated by the government. It's very fragmented. It's very hard to change. I am, however, assuming that Fonterra is no longer, and other ag players are no longer using coal and gas to dry milk in 2030. They will have no social license to operate if they continue to do so. They know that, and they're working very hard to change it. Yesterday's announcement may facilitate that in some areas. So I pulled 2 to 3 out. So collectively, 9 to 12 is kind of on the way. The Billion Trees program, which is, call it 10% underway at the moment, and is actually only 500 million trees above market. With my most optimistic face on is 3 to 5 million tonnes of reductions by 2030. You have to assume that the 24 that's there at the moment carries on. It won't, because we're about to move into a period of harvesting of trees, probably. And the government has, in their own numbers, estimate that the billion trees on an annualised basis will only offset about 1.5 million tonnes. So the Billion Trees program is a little bit useful, but it maybe gets us 10% of the reductions we need. And importantly, trees are a useful delay tactic, but they don't avoid the need for us to just fundamentally reduce emissions that are going out into the atmosphere. We need to stop emitting greenhouse gases. There's also a very low appetite for more trees, though I'll talk more in a moment, but there may be pressure to do so. Agriculture, whilst it represents half of our emissions and more if you include drying milk with coal, is incredibly politically fraught. There is massive debt on farms, and transitioning from the current model to another model is something that will take time and will require support. So I have allowed for 10%, which is the reduction in the Zero Carbon Act for biogenic methane. Immediately after signing this act, National came out and said it's too hard on the farmers. They're going to back off it. I know there are discussions about making that number bigger than 10%, but it's a very politically fraught area. So I think we'll be lucky if we get 4, and we should give the farmers and the agriculture sector this decade to evolve their business models such that they're ready to carry the weight for the country over the following 2 decades through a more rapid evolution of their business models. So all of that gives us on the order of 20-ish million tonnes of reductions when we need to find 30 to 35. So to make the numbers work, the only way we're going to get there is if we almost entirely decarbonise road transportation by 2030. So a couple of ways of reframing that or rephrasing that is we need to make petrol and diesel functionally extinct by 2030. And the way I increasingly think of this as a tool to imagine an alternative future is we need to imagine a world, a community, a town, where on the 1st of January 2031, you can't buy petrol anymore. You can't buy diesel anymore. If that were the case, how would we evolve our lifestyle, our towns, our businesses in a way that made them resilient to that change, that made them made us able to do that. So that's clearly quite an awkward conversation for many. It's a bigger change than most anticipate. And the reason for that is the government has chosen not to communicate the scale and rate of change that the science demands, because in the words of one politician, it's not a vote winner. And at the moment, only 10% of New Zealanders, our research shows, believe that climate change is the single biggest issue facing New Zealand. So many others who also care about climate change also care about housing, inequality, poverty, but they don't draw the dots generally between climate change, which will make all of those things worse, and the thing they care about. So we don't currently have a political environment that supports these kind of conversations. I'm going to quickly, I'll pause in a moment, but I want to quickly talk about reasons this might be wrong. Reason one is the government continues to not do very much, in which case you don't have to find anything. There will be a general, probably slow reduction in some emissions, but society will feel it through the changes that will come from climate change. If the government does choose to do it, then you've got to make the numbers work. The 2 other ways of making the numbers work are that you plant at scale, like, in a way that makes the 1 billion trees look like a weekend planting bee, and that might be 2.5, 3, 4 billion trees, and you might stop harvesting trees today. That has massive consequences on biodiversity. It has massive consequences on the communities that we're operating. It has massive consequences everywhere, including rolling over into land use and farming, sheep and beef most notably. The other thing you might do is agriculture. 39, you might pull a lot more, a lot faster out of that. As I mentioned before, that's not without its challenges, politically, technically, economically, but future governments of the day might choose to do that rather than pulling out of other areas. But the numbers, you've just got to make the numbers up somewhere. I think one of the things that we're missing at the moment is this discussion. How are we going to make the numbers work? And one of the things I've observed, in particular from the ag and the forestry sector, is a pushback on change, whereas I feel it would be more constructive to highlight the role that road transportation could play to give those other sectors more time to evolve their models and to demand of government that we implement policies that rapidly migrate us away from petrol and diesel. So I'll pause there in a moment and see if there's any questions to any of that, Harley.
Yes, there are. Well, there's 3 questions. Do you want me to just run through the 3 questions and then you...
Yeah, well, I'm going to ask them one at a time. And
yep.
I'll run through the 3 quickly and then we'll answer them in the order that makes sense.
You want me to run through them? Okay. The question about New Zealand's tourism industry and whether it can actually be climate sustainable if we include international aviation.
Yep.
And then a question about the fact that New Zealand's emissions on the global, in terms of the global picture, are very small. How can we, what can we do to have a real impact on the global situation?
Yep.
And then, two more. What the question about electric cars? Are they the biggest game changer?
Yep.
And then a question about councils' roles and what should councils be doing to have the biggest impact? And I think we should add to that, what should EDAs be doing to have a positive impact in this space as well?
Okay, so I'll answer a couple of them now, and I'll answer a couple of them in a slide. So tourism industry, in principle, that could be sustainable. Well, I wouldn't say it could be sustainable, but it could internationally could pick up. Global emissions associated with air travel are on the order of 3 million, so 3 of 81, for example, not within the Paris Accord, though, for weird reasons. So in principle, if we were to drop our emissions somewhere else, we could actually have a sustainable local tourism industry. We would also have to take into account that that industry, for example, moving people around, would have to be carbon free. So I don't think there's anything that fundamentally precludes that. The aviation sector over 3 decades may be able to move to a carbon-free solution for international travel as well. And we need to get, globally, emissions need to be, for CO2 and nitrous oxide, need to be net zero by 2050. So that's tourism. New Zealand emissions are small, and that's actually the case for every country. This is, unfortunately, there is no one country that can fix this. New Zealand is a gnat of a gnat on this. And that's the challenge in climate change. We all need to push against this. No one country can solve it. All countries need to contribute. If we don't contribute, all other things aside, fairness aside, we probably won't be able to plan global markets. Europe is talking about introducing carbon taxes or tariffs, and countries that fail to drop their emissions in line with what they consider reasonable will have hefty tariffs imposed on them. Electric cars, I'll get to that in a moment. Council, I'll get to in a moment, and EDAs, I'll get to in a moment. Okay, so what I'm actually going to do now, and what will possibly be an extremely high-risk technical move, is I'm going to migrate to sharing Auckland's story as an example of how grossly underestimated the plan is, and how the stuff most people are thinking about is nowhere close to what is needed. And that is the case for, in fact, every council in Auckland. This plays to the Auckland story. So bear with me a second. I'm going to unshare one thing, and I'm going to reshare something else. So so Harley, can you see that page?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Okay, so in Auckland, they have agreed to a 50% reduction in emissions by 2030. They don't have any space to grow trees, and they have no cows to fix or move elsewhere. So transport is the solution. If we look on the right-hand side here, you can see emissions that come out of moving people around, not freight, 2.8 million tonnes in 2018. If we just assume the population is going to grow as forecast, then, and everybody travels kind of the way they do today, we'll end up with 3.6 million tonnes of emissions in 2030. In order to comply with Auckland's reduction target, 30% by 2030, which all regions should have as a bare bones, we would need to get that to the yellow line here. But what we recognise is that some things are harder to move. For example, the ag sector is not going to reduce by 50% by 2030. For example, Glenbrook is not going to reduce by 50%. It can't. It either closes or stays. If it closes, there are hundreds of jobs and millions of dollars of GDP, like Southland has just seen. So we need to get to the green line by 2030. So the current thinking of Auckland Transport, and this plays out in every urban area around the country, is that we will do public transport things. They have committed some $15 billion worth of projects, and I'll quickly show by putting these tick boxes on the impact of those in the third column. So the City Rail link, which we'll assume rolls out and is full, has dropped it by, we'll call it 30 tonnes, 30,000 tonnes. So it's hardly moved the dial. We're comparing the middle bar, which is a do nothing scenario, with the right-hand red bar. If we then look at the two light rail projects, which are another $7 billion, we're down to 343. Let's say we do all of those public projects that are proposed. These are good projects. They do move people off cars. We're down to 3.4. So we're still not even close to where we wanted to be to get back to 2030, to get back to 2018 emissions, let alone getting down to the green line. Let's say we roll out a cycling investment program. Well, it's taking us a little bit further. Let's say we electrify every bus, of which there are 1,300, and that would cost us $6 billion. So we're at about $25 billion of spend. So we're down to, we've taken maybe not quite 10% out. We're not back to 2018 levels. So we've now played all of the cards that are currently on the Auckland Transport and Auckland Council plan for transport. And we're not even close to where we were in 2018. So we've heard this story about, well, we can't do anything for climate and sustainability because of the lack of budget, because of COVID. But the story actually is we have to do these things because we have no money. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you an alternative future. And I'm not going to say this is the right future, but let's say we go back to where we were before. And let's say rather than doing all that fancy stuff, we'll finish the City Rail link, the big tunnel, because it's terrible having a tunnel that goes nowhere. But let's say we just reduced the number of trips that we took. Let's travel less. And we know we can do that because we did that under COVID. So that's the single biggest thing. A 10% reduction in the number of trips taken is the single biggest thing out of anything we've just talked about. Let's say we took less long trips. We lived more local. And let's just do that 10%, an average of 10% reduction. So those two things have now taken us back to 2018. Two things. We've rolled out no infrastructure. This is basically a little bit of local planning, a little bit of localization, and some sort of information campaign. Let's now assume we reallocate roading away from cars. We take vehicle kilometres off the roads, and councils can do this. And we get to the level of cycling that Copenhagen has, which is 12 times more what we have today. That further moves the dial. We're back to below 2018 levels. If we do two additional things, let's bring in emission standards. We had them proposed, but they were shot down by one political party. Let's get the average car that has an engine in 2030 the same as the average new car in 2014. So rather than 250 grams, 230 grams per kilometre, let's get back to 108. So that's the single biggest thing we have done. We have eliminated almost half of those emissions by bringing into play emissions standards, which are just what the rest of the world does, and enforcing them aggressively. What that means in practice is that no more internal combustion only cars cross our border into New Zealand after 2025. So we need to stop bringing those things into the country. And we need to extend the life of those we've got as we wait for lower and no emission vehicles to come. The second thing we could do is we could do what Norway's done and put in a fee-based rebate kind of a structure. And if we followed them 5 years behind, 30% of cars in 2030 or of road transport would be electric. We've still got a lot of other cars that are not. But that takes us to within a hair's breadth of where we need to get to. And lastly, car occupancy. We need to move away from one person, 80 kilograms of meat, with one car, 2 tons of steel. We need to travel more efficient. We need to not waste roads on moving one person around. If our car occupancy was not 1.58, but was 2, we're down at the line. So that's an example of an alternative future for Auckland, but the same thing prevails in every urban region, different for rural. we need to travel less, we need to travel more local, we need to travel actively, bikes and scooters, we need to travel public, mainly by massive rolling out of buses. Those two things we need to move cars off our roads. We don't need to change the roads. Don't build more roads, don't build fancy roads. Put out paint and planter boxes that allow people to move actively safely. What's left, we need to decarbonise. Less emissions per car and no emissions vehicles. And that bears no resemblance to what everybody is doing today. So to the question about electric cars, yeah, they matter, but they're about the fourth thing that we should do over the next decade in redesigning how we move people around. And what councils can do, they need to move away from a car-centric city and towards a public and people-centric city by reallocating existing road space. And they need to start doing it right now. Roading charges, reallocating space, high occupancy lanes, getting rid of parking in cities, making parking extremely expensive if you emit. All of those things are within the realms of councils. Beyond the councils, they need to lobby governments for national emission standards and programs that facilitate movement towards electric vehicles, like fringe benefit taxes, etc., etc., etc. EDAs is a broader question. I don't have an explicit answer to EDAs. I would put them under or adjacent to councils. And I would also say, when you're thinking about giving out money or support, only give out money to people who are looking at moving towards a low carbon world. So I'll stop there. We've only got 5 minutes left, and if there's any other questions or comments, I can pick them up.
There's two questions that have come in, and one is just taking us back to the Paris Accord, and if you could just quickly explain why international flights weren't taken into account in the Paris Accord.
That's a very good question. I don't know the detail of that. So there's two things that are missing out of the Paris Accord and out of the Zero Carbon Act, and they are international maritime and international air travel. James Shaw has indicated a desire to bring them into the Zero Carbon Act. It's not clear that they will be brought into the evolving Paris, the Paris thing. So it's not the case that we shouldn't avoid those. We absolutely should. But the bit that's within, I guess, the formal structure, it's not within that formal structure at the moment.
Okay. And then the other question was about, that's your presentation for Auckland. What about people living rurally? What suggestions do you have for rural folk?
Yeah, so I think there's a different story here, and it really, I would have expected the farming community and the forestry community to be very, very vocal on advocating rapid decarbonisation of freight and transport. And the reason for that is, if it's not the cars, it's the cows. So somebody's got to bear the brunt of this, and I'm really surprised we haven't seen that yet from those communities. In terms of the actual solution, I would argue that in the urban type environment, of which a lot of New Zealand is, small towns around the country, we should be moving towards an environment that allows short trips to be taken more actively. So we should be creating cycle lanes everywhere, safe cycle lanes everywhere. We should be allowing micro mobility everywhere. If you're traveling 1 to 5 kilometers, you do not do it in a car unless you absolutely need to. And there will be cases where you need to. So I think that makes sense for urban townships. When you move into the broader rural space, it is most probably about the rapid electrification. I would like to see central governments and local government support moving to aggressively decarbonising the rural fleet fast. The vehicles are not available to do that easily. We don't yet have a Hilux equivalent, but we will in the next couple of years. So two things. The rural communities need to start getting active on this. They need to realise if it's not the cars, it's the cows. And they need to get to central government and tell them they need support to decarbonise their transport in the next decade.
Just quickly, 2 more questions have come through. One about working from home and the benefits of doing that. Does that feed into your...
Absolutely. That's a really massive one, and it fits under trips taken on the left-hand side. Roughly speaking, going to work accounts for about a quarter of trips. So if you were to take, 2 days a week, you've just pulled it. That's your, that's your your 10% almost. Now, not everybody can do that, but a lot of people can. So I would say, if we move to a 3-day working week in an office, or half of your office your time at home, we've probably almost pulled a lot of the emissions out of the country. Really, really important lever. Really important lever. And all councils should be allowing people to work from home. It is almost at the point now where it is irresponsible to not permit and enhance that happening.
Right. Okay, and then what's your impression of the electric car charging network in the country? Are we getting there, or got a long
Look, it's evolving, but in New Zealand, we for the most part live on something like a 1/4 acre section with a driveway where we can power things ourselves, unlike high density cities around the world. So for the most part, we can charge most of our cars most of the time in our homes. We do need a better one, in particular on the trunk routes between places, but that is evolving. So that's not a constraint. I think that's a red herring. We need to see more of that. But New Zealanders will, for the most part, charge their cars in their homes or at their works, which also can have power.
Okay. More questions. What value is placed on food production? Are there feedback loops on positive and negative access to food people will still need to eat? So
yes, I think we will actually globally, and this is recognised, and it's kind of a meter above this, is that we will need to redesign globally the way we think about food. New Zealand could absolutely be a contributor to food globally. At the moment, we, in the dairy space, 90% of our produce feeds people in other countries. There is an open question about the extent to which animal-based proteins are a big part of that in the future. They are being challenged on multiple fronts. There is a story about us being the clean, green source of animal proteins. We're not at the moment. We might become that. There's also another story about using that land for non-animal proteins. They're up for grabs at the moment, and there are strong arguments along all paths and even stronger emotions associated with those different paths.
Okay. I think we're almost right out of time, but there is one last question about, another one. Any considerations on the short-term economic impact of the changes proposed, e.g. working from home hurts CBT food services industries? Where can we go to for more information? And Susan telling me we need to wrap up.
Okay, so to the first one then, I think that this whole, we can't afford to do climate change because it's expensive is a complete nonsense. We have to do it because we have no money. This solution, I've just showed you an Auckland example where I've pulled $20 billion out. Like, you can do a lot of economic development with the rest of $20 billion. It is true that we need to evolve our cities, and it may be that those people that have cafes in the city have to move somewhere else. That will change. Our society will change. It will change because we design the change, or it will change because of climate change. And that's in our hands. So we need to front foot this, do that work, and design the cities we want for the future.
Okay. Well, I think we're out of time. So a massive thank you to you, Paul. Susan, I'm not sure if people have other questions outside of this webinar. Maybe I can put them to Paul via you, if that's okay.
Sure, happy to field questions and send them on to both of you.
Awesome.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you, Harley, for facilitating. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thanks, Paul. That was really insightful. Really great stuff. So thank you very much. And thank you, Harley, for emceeing it. Really great.
My pleasure.
And I'll end the meeting there. Thank you for everyone who shared it with us. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.